pay back their graduate school money or whatever. They don't give a shit.
Yeah.
These guys all have the same degree as you.
No, they have inferior degrees since we're not recording because they're a bunch of hacks. Psychology is a hack.
Oh, the podcast has already started.
Oh, has it?
Welcome back to the show.
Well, I'll actually publicly say psychologists are trash most of the time.
Agreed.
Easily. What are you talking about?
But what about Jordan Peterson?
Also trashed, but
Shots fired.
Shots definitely fired. Listen,
Fired.
It's messy, and you're pretending it's not messy. That's what I don't
That's true. You think he pretends it's not messy?
like. Not as much as he used to. Like the whole 5 personality traits, and like every time I listen to Jordan Peterson podcast or talk, it's like I'm going to hear about these 5 personality characteristics and temperament and conscientiousness, and I just know those are coming out of his mouth.
And you don't think those are valid
No,
categories?
they're valid categories, but like anytime you do stuff like that, you're drawing, like they drew those categories, right? And so they're very like the way you would think about it, like in a data structure sense, like it's very exponentially driven. Like it's not clean data. So I can do all this modeling with clean data, like that makes a good bell curve. But if I don't have a bell curve type of system, like think of height as a bell curve system and think of income as like an exponential system. That makes sense. And it's not quite that way. It's just like those things are so messy that you can't, like when you start deriving what predictions off them, it's going to break in like 1 second, which it does every time.
So like predicting someone's conscientiousness or something like that.
Like they're going to give it a score and then they'll try to predict their behavior off of it. But I would say there's probably more correlation than causation going on in these different ways. Again, it's like how they drew the lines. Like
Right.
we did this body of work and they got to do something. Like the DSM-5, whatever it's called, it's like this huge body of like mental health and psychological work. But a lot of things just don't have biomarkers to them. So you can't actually measure them in sense of like material. You can measure it in terms of like frequency or behavior. So like say your kid goes to get autism diagnosed or whatever, they're going to measure it on behavioral things, not like, oh, I did a brain scan and there's the like that's not how it works. It's all like, oh, is this kind of close enough to the category? Which, that's why they go with the whole spectrum route. Like, where are you on the spectrum? Right? Because if it's a spectrum, then we're all on it.
And then you can always be right. Right.
And you can also always be right because
right.
it's just fuzzy. That's what I mean. It's like a fuzzy thing to do. It's like, well, women have this or men have this. And like, it's just similar to like what they do in biology. Like, this is our category, this is a category where we're recording because it's good shit. And fundamentally, like the man and woman distinction is pre-language. So this is what I would say. Like your vision, your brain is set up for spatial kind of processing. The language is an encoding of that like the concept, right? So the language is secondary to the reality. So, but you take postmodern people or all these people that are really into this dialectic language games and what means what. That's where all that breaks down. So what is a woman, right? The latest trend. It's like, well, a woman's so fundamental to human knowledge that we made up words to call it that. We know what it is.
Right.
Right.
So we don't have language for it per se, right?
Well, we do have language for it, but like that's when you start manipulating. Well, okay, that's a woman. So let's talk about all the characters. Let me break these into the components, right? And then say, well, this is a component of woman. This is not. But some of those components are just human components, which is where they get around drawing this line instead of this line. Well, actually, a woman has all these things.
Right.
That's a female penis or whatever the shit they come up with, right?
Well, and that's why it gets so difficult to have the conversation about like women in sports and other sorts of characteristics, because you're like, well, everybody has different characteristics. So to steel man the left, like their argument is like, you got guys who are incredibly gifted and they're in the NBA, right? And they have a genetic advantage over people who aren't, right? And so they're like, we allow for that. Why don't we allow for trans men in women's sports or trans women in women's sports? Because there's a biological advantage. Because there might be a biological advantage. Maybe we can agree with that. But we allow it in some situations than others. We don't want any categories to exist.
Yeah, I think the issue also became like it really got really identity based, and like I have a different perspective of identity. But like you're talking about. Like people say, oh, this is what I am. I'm a whatever. I'm a firefighter or whatever the version of that story. Like I'm a black man. I'm a whatever, right? So this is my identity. But that's not exactly how identity really was thought about, not even that long ago. It's really relationship. Like I'm a father because I have a son and a child, right? It's like there's a fundamental reality and then I'm describing who I am in relation to that thing. And as far as like man and woman, like you just are that. And if you, like you say, people say they're born in the wrong body, like, well, you wouldn't be you if you weren't in that body. Like that's who you are. Like this is who you are. You're this way. right? Doesn't mean like the characteristics of manly men need to apply to you, right? But you're still, that's just who you are.
Right.
You're a guy who might have more characteristics overlap than what is feminine in our culture. Again, everything's contextual, like the sign of the times, everything else. Like,
I have a question.
yeah,
So you know how Alex Jones said that they were turning the frogs gay?
yeah.
And there's actually is it astrazine? Is that the chemical that can actually
No,
biologically changing frogs if you submerge them in it or expose them to enough of it will make them into a viable female frog, a male frog into a viable female frog.
it's like the mechanism to do it. It's from that drug somehow.
That chemical just somehow changes the DNA structure. If at some point technology gets to the point, CRISPR say, gets to the point where it can turn a biological male into a biological female, does that count?
Well, no,
Is that a female?
I wouldn't call it as a material only. Like if you go to material only and that's how you define it, then yeah, you could do that.
So you're looking at it more holistically than
More
just
holistically,
like,
right?
you
The
know,
material is
your DNA
part
says-
of you, right? Because your consciousness, where's that fit in? Right? Where's that in you? Like you have one, right? But I'm having a lot of trouble like identifying exactly where that lives. I know if I sever these brain connections that you'll go dark to me, but I don't know what that's like. Again, like it goes into like Thomas Nagel land. Like what is it? How do you know what it's like to be somebody who's not conscious to you? How do you know what it's like to be a bat? How do you know what it's like to be a cat? Like we just don't have access to that perception. Like we just don't have it. So I don't know if that helps or makes it more convoluted.
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, you know, part of that conscious part, I think, is what a lot of the transgender community cites when they say, I don't feel like
Right.
a male or a female. I feel like this ambiguous different thing or the opposite or whatever. And so, yeah, maybe it makes it more confusing. I'm not sure, but kind of fascinating because I feel like the biological piece is the bedrock piece.
That's part we can, because we
people
can
are like-
measure with numbers. That's what people like is the numbers, right? But that's not the only thing you measure with that. And like sometimes you're measuring things that we just don't understand a lot too. Like what we definitely understand, XY chromosome. That's pretty basic. And then you got the little space where, you know, you got anomalies in some births that do happen, double XY. So that's very small, which is never who like that would be cited in for legislation reasons because there is these people and they do need help and you don't want them to get caught in the court system or wherever else. I'm guessing, you know, I don't know. I'm not in charge of medical law, but you know, when they do these cutouts, like Montana just passed their bans, like their cutouts are for those types of people that are in that weird space where it's basically a pathology or what we would consider a pathology.
Like a medical anomaly.
Yeah, it's a medical anomaly.
There's a space between what you're saying, like the material where you have like a particular genetic expression and like your psychology, which is like the way you experience the world, right? So that subjective experience of the world, no one else can get a window into. So when it says, I feel like this, there's no way to confirm that.
Yeah, you can't mind read. Yeah.
So I think what the left says is they're saying, there's no way to confirm that. So we should bias ourselves and bias our institutions to acknowledging their right to the fact that no one can know that. So therefore we should treat them the way they feel, which there's like, I think there's in general in there's like politeness, right? Someone's like, hey, call me Zeke now. I was Zach, but now I want to be called Zeke. So you're like, you know, nicknames and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then with pronouns, it kind of exists in that space. The question is just how far does that go before like the legislation kicks in, which is like other people's kids or even your own kids. Where do you go to the point where that is a violation that the state needs to step into? That's where the whole debate, I think, should be happening.
Right. It's not about what you're doing individually. It's about, are the systems indoctrinating people into a system that they wouldn't otherwise individually, independently choose to be a part of.
Right. And the media has done a terrible job at that, right? Especially with the Montana legislation, where it's pretty much been like, this bans people from saying they, them pronouns or something like that, right? They just have done a bad job about what's actually in the legislation. When is the state, what is even the discussion?
Well, their interest isn't to create clarity.
I'm sorry, you said call it a bad job. Like I would call it, they're doing a good job because they want an outcome, and this is going to get them closer to it. So if you're going up from that reference standard, like they're doing pretty damn good.
Yeah,
they're getting their shit done. They can conflate and convolute and like, oh, see, look at these dumb redneck Trump supporters in Montana. I mean, that's the narrative, right? So
yeah,
like,
exactly.
So. But it's odd to me, like you got Montana where it's like, oh, like you are not allowed to do any of this stuff. Like I don't care if your parents want to do it. Like you're just not allowed to basically sterilize children under 18. Don't get me started. I'm going to find King George's the place, right? And then you got a place like Washington where it's like, well, actually at a certain age, even under 18, it's none of the parents' business if we transition. Like that is crazy to me. Not only the difference between those two, but also that like in Washington, like how do you live in Washington as a parent where you have plenty of, like, this happens it happens more than zero. I know people, I'm sure you guys know people where there's these groups that they set up in the school and they bring the kids in because, especially probably during the end of school, during June, like this is the month to recognize this. And then they just go to work on them. Right. And again, like the identity, like how you identify, like that word, like what does identity mean? Like, who are you? Like, are you like take somebody like my potential 13-year-old son in Washington, right? Let's just hypothetical this. Like, oh, are you just a white male, hetero, whatever? Is that who you're going to be? That awful thing, right? Because after I propagandized you with all the awful things, I know none of the good things can go through there. But again, like the whole identity of what your material makeup is stupid anyway. It's it's a relationship thing to me. Like I'm your friend, right? That's my identity right now in some ways, right? And so I also have these things.
Let's back up real quick. So your theory of identity is that it's fundamentally relational.
Yeah, it's a web of relationships and where you sit in it.
Yeah, yourself implies an other, and your other actually informs yourself's like identity.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if you're kind of starting there, then you're like, well, I express this way to the world and I am this way. And I think that's where I think some of the right's criticisms of the trans movement might start to make sense in this sense. You have boys who are more feminine, maybe gay, and then being told that they're actually a girl, and then being expected to be able to navigate that before they really have that full information of self, like where their referential is just like, well, you're a more feminine boy, so you might be a girl, where, 10 years ago, we would have said, maybe you're gay, maybe you're not, maybe you're just a feminine guy, maybe you're metrosexual. We had categories for this we don't talk about anymore.
And this is where jail needs to come in. And I say it for the doctors and everybody pushing this stuff, because not only are you doing that in the way that's very negative, like imagine saddling a 16-year-old with all the college debt. We already complained about 18-year-olds walking to that. We think that's almost immoral in itself. Certainly for a 16-year-old, we think that, right? But we're going to allow you to sterilize yourself, because there is no going back. I don't care who the hell with what fucking medical degree they have says some shit like that. They are full of it, right? Those are the people that go to jail first. Who is on record saying stupid things like that? And you're the first one in the tribunal, because that's crazy. Like you're literally sterilizing children in a very confusing time of their lives based on what you think is good, how you speak back to the feel, how you feel things should be. Well, how you feel things should be versus how we all feel things should be. That's just not the same. And we live in a community, so we got to figure this out. But yeah, to me, like it's unconscionable to me what like that, like crossing into that realm. I barely like it for adults, but I'm also, good luck telling adults what to do all the time.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I mean,
you can put all the laws in the books you want, somebody's still going to do some things.
If you are a small business owner looking for exponential growth, you have to connect with Adam Thuen at Intellectual Patriots. He will revolutionize your business game and help you get to the next level. Adam can streamline your business practices and advertising strategies to improve your bottom line. His expertise in data engineering means he can build you the systems you need to collect and analyze market data. His mission is to provide you with invaluable insights to fuel your success. From grant writing and business proposals to digital systems integrations, even AI management, Intellectual Patriots is a one-stop shop for cutting-edge solutions. Don't wait another second. Visit intelpatriots.com to learn more. That's INTEL patriots.com.
Right. Right. Well, additionally, that like if you're saying like an adult can't say I get the risks and I'm going to take the risks, right? If you can't do that, you're not in a free country anymore, right? But the question is when can the state step in on behalf of a child and say you're not capable yet of making this decision?
Well, I like the analogy about the leg thing, where people are like, well, if I want to walk in and say to a doc, I don't think I should have a leg, so I want you to cut this off. Like most states actually have the laws on this already, I think. And there is a pathology that people have. Like, oh, I'm not going to remove healthy tissue that works, right? And that's true for a lot of things. I've had a couple organs removed during surgery. Like, it's not because they worked. You know what I mean? It's like, you know what? I don't want my spleen gone today because I just identify as asplenic today. So it's like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So, and plus it's the risks are, you talk about COVID vax risks, like that's a different tangent, but it's in the realm. Like you have no idea what you're doing. This has not been around that long. You are blasting people with other hormones. Like, I don't know what will happen. You're going to get cancer. You're going to get the thousands of things, and you won't be able to tell for a long time too, because we have all our cancer rates are up, our mental health issues are up. But it's just like there's so, like, what am I saying? There's so many ways that happens in society. I definitely think this is going to be a cause of some of those other like actual medical problems later. And it'll be one of those things like not as bad as smoking, but pretty close. Like, oh, turns out we should have easily saw this coming. You stick a bunch of tar in your fucking lungs, it's going to not like it.
Right.
So,
Well, I think, the hard question here is, because, you mentioned these doctors that are doing these surgeries, they're taking a certain subjective view of what harm is, right? Like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, has been the underpinning of the medical profession for, as long as there's been a medical profession.
Sure.
But now the definition of harm is sort of, it's nebulous because there's psychological harm and there's all these other things. And so I think the big question really is like you said, we are not in a place to know what the long-term ramifications are. And so are we going to look back on this in 20 or 50 years and go, wow, like we had a really, it was like that was like the bloodletting of our generation. Like maybe we look back on it and go, oh, well, like there were some side effects and we didn't know, but like, I think that's the big question is like, what's going to happen long-term? And the problem I think is that there's not an objective story around this. Like the kids that are walking into this and coming out of it and detransitioning aren't getting both sides of the story. They're not getting the rewards and the risks because this agenda is being pushed. It's not objective.
And even if they did, are you going to let your 16-year-old just weigh the pros and cons and make a decision? Like how?
I personally don't think that. We have these like agency rules around signing contracts and things of that nature. We have you're a minor until you're 18, or maybe it should be older than that. But right now, that's what it is. Like we have those rules for a reason because young people aren't mentally capable of looking around certain corners. They don't have all of the brain development done yet that would give them more tools to say, is this really what I want? So no, I don't
you're not an adult. You're good at dying and sent to war. That's basically the truth, right? That's the law. Like, can you go to war? Yes, adult, right? That's what we did. Anybody dispute that's not the rule?
No.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like the second you can go to war, adult, right? Yeah. That's what they made it. So that's
unless you're buying alcohol or doing a bunch of
that's
stuff.
True.
And then you got this little
different
delay
minor
time frame.
Well, you can buy tobacco, right?
Right.
Like,
but now you can't. Not anymore.
Can't buy tobacco.
A bunch of states are removing tobacco till 21. Yeah.
I'm not
backing it up. But not voting. Gotta keep voting all the way.
Speaking of boomer, I'm gonna be like, well, I'm really glad that I made it through and I did some smoking of tobacco and maybe drinking underage and all these other things, or drinking at 21. But now that I'm older and I got all my degrees, actually, I think most people should wait till 27 before they engage. And I actually do believe that. But how do you make that law switch? That's a little different. Again, if you can go die, if they're going to send you to go die, so you take a little peyote on your way out. Like, am I going to be mad at you for that? If that's what they're going to do, they're going to send you.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're all over the place. but to your point, like the problem, you said, what's the problem? I said, what the problem is Plato. So the problem with this is Plato, like the body's the prison house of the soul. Like that mentality of this duality, like, oh, this is my spiritual feeling self, and this is my body. Somebody like yourself says, well, those are united, and we can measure some things and we cannot measure some things. You know what I mean? Like you are your body and your consciousness. Like those are two components of you. Right. And we don't want to diatribe to all the different ways you can describe that because there's been plenty over the years. But I think there's people that look at the world that way and there's people that don't look at it that way. And so I think if you're in that dualistic way to think about it, you can really rationalize why you should allow people to be who they feel like they are. Right.
Because their soul is just trapped in that body.
Their soul is trapped in that body, that mentality.
But there's also the more material, right? Your atheistic, right? Your consciousness is just an expression of the chemistry of your brain. Yeah, and it's just an illusion, right? It's an emergent phenomena of the brain. Yeah, I love that word. That's my favorite word.
It's called magic. That's what I call it in science. Whenever somebody writes fucking emergent in a paper, I'm like, oh, you said magic happens, and then shit pops out. Like, give me a break with this stuff.
But it's true. It's like a property that doesn't have a central cause. It's a property.
It's a scale transformation. It's a higher scale.
Right.
Yeah.
So like they're saying, I think the thought experiment in that space for the trans issue is if you had a pill that would align your consciousness with your body, would that be immoral? Right. So for example, your body has a particular expression of a chromosome. You take this pill. You were feeling like you had the opposite chromosome, but it aligns it. It says this is actually what it is.
I've actually heard this argument,
and then changes, and then that would change your consciousness. So if that's the model, would that pill be wrong? Right. Or should the government force everyone who is in that position to take the pill?
Can I just clarify what you're saying?
Yeah.
So you're suggesting, or the question is, if there was a pill that could change your consciousness to reflect the biology, would that be immoral?
Right. Would that be a problem?
This is very hypothetical, but I would say before that, I think how it looks in real life is like, say Montana goes one step further and says, oh, if somebody's got gender dysmorphia and they want to change and they're a man trying to become a woman, I'm going to throw testosterone at them like there's no tomorrow. I'm going to go the other way. You know what I mean? So similar to what you're saying, but like instead of treating them with estrogen when they're not set up to get that, you go the other way. Like, well, maybe we can work on you being okay with you because it is you.
I heard RFK recently, RFK Jr. say something to the effect of that he felt like some component of this gender dysphoria conversation, the trans conversation, was precipitated by chemical exposure. Did you guys hear that or see that?
No.
I thought it was really interesting because, I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about all the endocrine disruptors that are in all the plastics and all the liners of all the bottles and cans and, you know, in polyester in our clothes and in all the cleaning products and in everything, you know what I mean? And we're just inundated with all these chemicals and it's causing some of these physiological changes like the astrazine and the frogs, you know, only on a slight scale.
So a social experiment on that. How many kids from vegan households have gender dysmorphia?
Kyle?
Look it up, Kyle.
More than zero.
Good luck.
More than zero.
More than zero?
Well, I would say, like, you know, and obviously even you would expect it to be because it is both biochemical, as Adam's saying, I think, and then psychological, meaning like you could have all the biomarkers of a man, have all the typical testosterone levels and all these other things, but still have an experience of reality that pushes you that direction. And, or you can change your own mind towards that too. I mean, like, the human brain is incredibly malleable, right? Like you can change your mind about things. So if under the certain social pressure, wouldn't it be true that someone might, you know, decide for themselves that that's how they want to feel and therefore start feeling that way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you put, to go back to the RFK part, like, do you think it's more of that or the fact that, especially lately, it's been a complete info cannon all over, everywhere, all the time? We made a national month holiday, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then how they're treated in the as a protected class, which, you know, especially in contrast to other classes which are not protected, which is getting smaller by the second, right? Like everyone's protected but you know. And so like, but then people have that and say they are the non-protected, right? Like, well, I obviously can see, and this goes to like economic like incentives, like obviously my life's gonna be better if I just do it,
Right.
right? And now I have all these people around me and we're all a community, kind of, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the language they use, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think that's a huge component of it. I mean, I think, you know, people want to belong from a very fundamental human place. We all need community evolutionarily to survive, right? And so if you feel disenfranchised from the broader population, if you feel different, if you feel weird, and maybe that part's driven by some chemical exposure changes that occur through environmental stimuli, you want to feel attached to a group. And so you find the one that is welcoming to you. And I think that's probably a part of what's happening. And it's being very heavily, you know, pushed in the media.
So if I had to say it, like we'll go both angles on it. So let's take the material chemical part. So like certainly some drugs and some neurotransmitters, whatever, everybody kind of gets a general grasp of this. If I get X amount of drugs in my body, let's call it THC because it's an easy one. If I take THC, there's going to be a material effect on, I think it's the presynaptic neuron blocking the cannabinoid uptake receptor. That sounded sciencey enough, right?
Yeah.
So like,
I believed it.
Somebody look that up. I'm not a weed scientist.
Can you say that one more time slowly?
Tell us about the vegans.
Yeah,
Kyle.
the vegans. You're
Get
still
us-
on the
get us
vegan
that.
task.
I'm switching cameras. I'm looking up vegans.
Oh, you're
I've
so
got
busy back there. I was joking. No, but so that like, so it changes something about like, to say the network. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds, and maybe I couldn't even try it right now with my lexicon, but like it's the network that kind of like takes in the perception of stimuli, and then it bounces against your preconceived and all that stuff. So all that's wired in, let's say. Let's go completely material for a second, because that's what science is all material basically. And it's like, okay, that's great. That chemical can change that, and now you're getting new stimulus, and now you're hitting against that chemically affected network. Well, what's fun, or not fun for me, because it's what I studied. So I studied the attention component of things and then how it interacted with value and probability in the visual cortex. So we did some experience like that. But attention is I would say when you use your attention, like you will allocate brain resources to those things. And so that will have its own effect. And the most neuroscience research about what changes stuff is actually about how the neurons are firing and different stuff like that. There's a little bit of long-term effects that happen, but also short-term effects and how the wiring goes. So as you're attending to a thing, it changes how you're going to perceive the next thing, if that is any way to say it. So as your duration, that's why I talk about the info cannon, like as you're been inundated with all this stuff all the time, right? Not to mention all the social pressures. Again, your attention is on these things, right? You will perceive things differently based on what you're attending to, right? Does that make sense?
Right.
So if I'm attending to the LBG Pride Month or all this pride stuff all the time, because again, it's in my face, it's in my school, it's everywhere, right? As I get new information, it's gonna change how I processed it from before that event, right? I'm gonna think about things a little bit differently right now. So both things change it. And I would argue probably pretty strongly that the attention, it probably drives more than the chemical, but like all great science people, let me caveat that with, I'm sure it's both, you know what I mean? Like,
conduct some experiments.
Nobody's really experiment.
It's
Maybe I
emergent.
I can write a grant for that if the NIH wants to pay me money to prove that they're silly. Yeah, no problem.
Somehow I think that'd be a tough sell, but
They might not fund me.
might not. Yeah.
But if I was in a protected class, then they might fund me.
You are bald.
You see the incentive problem. I know. I'm bald. I'm white.
That just makes us look villainous. It's not a.
That's true.
right. Yeah, Lex Luthor.
Yeah. Which name a bald superhero? Try, sir.
I can't. I know you're a bigger nerd than me. You would know if there was.
Professor X. That's it. And he's a bad guy too. So
is he?
Yeah. Oh yeah. He turns into a bad guy. Turns into Onslaught. Kills the entire Marvel universe.
What?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
I didn't make it that far.
90s comics.
Spoiler alert.
Professor X from X-Men?
Yeah. Could you think of another one though? There's like very few.
I just looked up top 10 bald heroes in Marvel.
Oh wow!
I was on the ball. That's what's going on. What do we got?
And this one's a little bit easier, right?
Is it on baldguy.com? Because I don't trust that
No,
website.
it's on Marvel.com.
It's all kind of propaganda, David.
Exactly.
Marvel.com had a whole article about bald superheroes.
I like that we're getting out there. We need some more support.
We need our own interest group. That's really
you
our
do.
problem, right?
You need to do some lobbying.
Yeah. I mean, the gender lobby has it locked down. I mean, we got to catch up.
Do we?
No, you don't. You're
not
just
in the
getting replaced in every single Disney movie.
First off,
That's
you don't know
true.
what, you don't know
Have you
what's like
noticed
Yeah,
that?
Ariel was the last one to go. It's a sad day.
You don't know what it's like to be
redheads.
bald.
I don't.
So I don't think you should speak on
But
what
I
it's
am,
like to be
I am descendant. Hold on now. I am descendant from bald people. Actually, my dad is very bald.
So I want to see the 23andMe. I don't trust you. I need to see the
I see
evidence.
family photos.
Joe's like, I have residual ancestral data. That's right. Proves this.
I am more descended from bald than Elizabeth Warren is descendant from Native Americans. I'll tell you that. Wow, we've gotten
anyways.
off to a really fun start.
Yeah.
Not even close to on topic. If there is one, I don't know, but it's been really, really fun conversation.
Well, it's Joe or Adam's second time in the studio. Our first attempt was early on when we were just getting started, and we had a technical malfunction, so we never could release it. We got to get you in. That was probably 10 episodes ago. So we're pumped to have you back, Adam, and give us your take. Last time you were coming just back from Helena after testifying for Defend the Guard. And we didn't really get to cover Defend the Guard that much while the session was going on. So I just wanted to give a little bit of time so we could just pivot over to policy a little bit. Well, I guess we were talking policy, but
Yeah,
a different
18,
policy.
18 you can die. So now you're an adult. So let's go from there.
There you go.
Yeah, right. So yeah, tell us about your experience, like testifying, Defend the Guard. Well, actually, let's start out. What's Defend the Guard, and why'd you go up there and go testify on it?
So Defend the Guard is a legislation. I'm going to give a quick, it's been a hot minute. Basically, it says the state of Montana will not provide its resources for an unconstitutionally declared war overseas, if I got the one-liner right. So there was a good push for this in a couple states, Montana being one of them. I know Liam McCollum did a lot of work raising some ground stuff in that. I'm sure there's other people that mentioned that I don't know, but he was the guy that told me about it. And I had known Liam for a while. So a lot of veterans, I think for us, when I think about it for myself, if I'm allowed to do such things instead of getting a policy wonk line, it's like for me, like obviously a lot of foreign excursions, especially lately, have been less about what they said originally and more about empire preservation, empire building in some ways, right? And so that's not but that's not the narrative they give to you. They give to you, you're going to fight them over there so they don't come over here. All these favorite
Gotta stop the
lines.
next Hitler.
Got to stop the next Hitler, right? Got to kill some Russians. Best money we ever spent, stuff like that, right? So when like
Damn.
That's a Lindsey Graham one-liner right there.
did I throw that in there?
Yeah,
For you guys weren't ready?
You just left it in there, and it's just like, you're just going to leave it hanging out there.
Leave it hanging. You know what I mean? Right. So you got the policy people making those, like that's what either they think that way because the donors want them to do that, or they actually think that way. And so how many efforts do you have at somebody like me to even attempt to send a signal that we don't like this stuff. We're done with this stuff. And so I think a good signal is the veteran crew pushing against that kind of stuff. And this is an avenue to do it. Right. Now, as far as like the actual testifying and listening to stuff, honestly, a little disheartening to see a couple things. I'll tell you a couple things that was disheartening. One of them was it was clear that the people who were testifying on both pro and con sides maybe had, like, there's people from all over. Like, do you think this is about Montana? No. There's people from outside of Montana that have a lot of power. Like, they just do. Like, I'm not going to deny their power and influence because they have it. And they're doing it here with our legislature. So, I mean, in lieu of a Montana-centric way, you might have influences from outside. And that includes the Pentagon, that includes like national organizations for vets and stuff like that. And including from the pro side, we got plenty of organizations that this is their mission. They want to stop this from happening, and this Defend the Guard is their mechanism to do it. And they have different versions in different states. So I didn't like that as much, but I get that that's just how it's worked for a really long time. Right. It's the lobby network. So that was a disheartening. A little other disheartening was listening to the pro testimony. Right. Because it goes back to all about money. Right. If you do this, we won't get any money. It's like, yes. So money should not, and probably never should, be a calculation in your morality. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, it always about the money. Like, oh, they're not going to resource us. This is against, whatever. Right. So listening to those kind of things, and like, again, you're sitting again in a legislative body, and what are they caring about? Money. And a little bit of bills and a little bit of morality. So it's that kind of environment. And then listening to, the rhetoric, and it's rhetoric they're going to say, and you can have a defense prepared for it, but it's going to work anyway. And it did, to be frank. It passed through the committee, and then, as time goes by and they don't get that initial rush, because the other thing is, like, people who went up there to testify, like, you leave work, like, it's not easy to get there. And one guy that came with me, actually, if I would have known this, I would have told him to stay home, especially given the result. Like, he lost money on a day's pay, and he's not like one of those guys that can just do that. Right. So he leaves his job for the day, comes up there to testify, right? When he's going against generals and he put that one guy, right, used to serve, doesn't like what's going on, and then he's against the generals and all the people that have a vested interest in things not changing. What a surprise they don't want him to change. Shocked me to death, right? But to have him go up there and lose that money on that kind of cause, and just it's all in general. I'm not saying people shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's tough to see that.
It's tough. Yeah.
And you're like, oh man, like maybe because it was always a long shot anyway. And so if that's what you have to give up to do that, then maybe don't do that, or do it a different way, because you could have signed some or wrote it in. But I will also say it's incredibly hard to, like, a written word from a guy nobody's ever heard of.
Yeah.
Right.
Or a phone call, or even a remote Zoom in. Like, I agree, like, from a guy who's never heard of versus the general of Montana. Like, you need how many of those people to erase just his one rhetoric full of shit testimony
And he gets to do on the clock.
that he gets to do on the clock with people he probably has drinks with after this is over. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's just like, man, that's a big hill.
Right. And if you're a citizen legislator sitting on a committee hearing this, I mean, you're speaking to someone who's very high up in the military. There's a lot of that just, authority and power. And it would be really hard to even in your heart know, like, well, this is the right thing to do to pass this Defend the Guard legislation, but to then stand in the face of that and say, we're going to do it.
Well, I also noticed, and this is probably protocol too, so I'm not going to give too much, but I noticed because there's two different uniforms you can wear. You can wear the combat uniform, the regular uniform that kind of has been on standard since even like then the war started. Like, you just wear your little camo fatigues that you would wear out on mission everywhere. But to this, they showed up in all their shiny shit, right? Like, it's that's part of it. Like, why do they do that? Same reason. So when they message talks, like, again, people they've been associated with, this is what's important. This is an important person. And he is an important person. And he has a view. And people always get into that appeal authority logic. Like, well, he's authority and he believes this, so he's probably right. And that could be true. but doesn't mean it has to be true. And I would say it's not true given what he said, because he just made up things about this has been a constitution. The Supreme Court has already decided this, which pretty sure has been debunked a million times by everybody who brings it up.
Yes.
So it's just like those kind of things coming out of his mouth in the uniform, in real time, out the gate with the most time, right? Compared to everybody else. It's just like,
it's tough to fight that.
Yeah.
So it didn't pass. Obviously, it had a couple chances,
Well, it died in the
but
House.
it did well.
Yeah. It did well compared to other states that have introduced the legislation.
And so, what are the ongoing like positives of what Defend the Guard was able to do in this session?
Well, actually, let me give one more thing too.
Sure.
Almost no bill that's a brand new idea passes the first time it's tried in Montana
He
legislature.
knows more about this than I do.
I mean, almost ever, right? So because it's a citizen legislature, I mean, like tons of bills that are really great will get introduced first time. People are like, let's let it sit for 2 years, and it gets vetted out more. The interest groups that are kind of behind the bill can like come together and either work out compromises or better define their differences. And then the second time around, that's when you really get a chance to pass a bill. And so especially something with this much money on the line and this much change in value and this much of asking legislators to engage in the space they're not used to, foreign policy, right?
Yeah.
These legislators did not sign up for that job. Like they're here because they're like, I don't like my property taxes, or, I want funding for the new library or something like that. The incentives for being a local legislator is completely different than that.
Right.
So like, it was amazing that it got as far as it did from my perspective. Sorry, I didn't mean to totally.
No, that's fine. I think
your question.
you totally answered it. So you think that this session, what it was able to accomplish, is substantial and would have positive ramifications down the road if it were to come back up.
Yeah,
in Montana.
You can build in the interim, and they can build in the interim. That's the question, right? And is the interest groups that are opposed to it doing that work, or is the interest groups that are for it going to spend the next 2 years talking to legislators, lobbying them on the issue, educating them on the issue so that they can have a firmer grasp of the trade-offs? And there's a lot of work you can do too. Like if what's the national group? It's just called Defend the Guard, right? Dan McKnight's outfit?
Maybe. Don't know.
I think so.
No,
Yeah, that's the
not sure.
national group that's really pushing it. If they spend the interim saying, this is the actual budgetary implications, and it's not as bad as it looks, or saying, no, this is actually, here's a brief on the actual Supreme Court case, so you can inoculate that attack. That's the best things you can do in between sessions that really makes a difference in passing the bill the second go around.
Can you clarify really quick if you know what the specific Supreme Court case was? Because it was not directly about this.
I looked it up at the very beginning of session, and it wasn't directly related. It's not what you think it is. It had to do with...
I have it right here.
Okay.
I'm on the Defend the Guard website, defendtheguard.us. There's tons of information here. But so in 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Congress may authorize members of the National Guard of the United States to be ordered to active federal duty for purposes of training outside the United States without either consent of a state governor or the declaration of a national emergency.
It was training. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Not
I don't know how long
combat.
they've been doing it, but like every state National Guard, like just not really state guards, but they're state, like Montana National Guard has a partner country. That's how it's been going. I don't know how long. Like I went, like in 2014, I went with the Hawaiian National Guard to Indonesia to be their civil affairs guy, which is a different story. But like these partnerships have been around, right? So I would wonder if that was protecting those because, and if you think about it from a national perspective, if I could go there, if I could channel my foreign policy, high level stuff, be like, all right, well, we just made these agreements with these countries and I don't need some fucking governor coming in and tanking years of work in the, like that could disrupt peace.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to send them to a pre-agreed train. Like, you know what I mean? So like that, I can see how that goes. But when it comes to the war thing, that's what I mean. Like they were talking about that was the war answer. Right. But I mean, and I was telling this to Liam too, like everything, like you said, it's basically a big, long negotiation and really feeling out the legislatures, which change. So it's like doing a negotiation as your parties are changing, you know, because like, oh, I don't like this word in here. If you used a different word, I'd say yes. You know what I mean? Like you got all these different personalities in there. But if they would have passed it as it was, like there's still ways the government can get their, you know, get their blood out of the turnip, right? They'll be like, all right, fine. You can't deploy in support of the new NATO war to Ukraine, to really throw it a concrete example. But what you can do is you can now be the Benning training guard for everyone. So now you're in charge of Fort Benning and you're going to train people to go fight. Since you won't, we're still going to deploy you in support of this effort in this way. And there's nothing that I saw in that legislation that would stop them from doing that.
Yeah.
Or train, are you going to go train to really ice on the Supreme Court thing? Like, you're going to go train people in Poland.
Yeah.
You're not in a combat zone. I understand your trainees are about to go to combat, but that's not technically combat. So therefore, because of 1990s, you know what I mean? So you can still do these things, right? So it's not like it was, again, that's what's more about the message of the entire holistic, which I think most people kind of understand.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the Fortress America bill. It wasn't saying you can't do anything with these forces. It was just saying you can't deploy them to undeclared illegal wars, right? I mean, from our constitutional interpretation, interpretation of the Constitution, we see these wars as being unconstitutional because they weren't declared by Congress. Congress can't just say, hey, President, you now have the right to deploy troops anywhere and everywhere you want to forever. That's delegating something that the Constitution delegates to the Congress. You can't delegate away a power that's been delegated to you by the Constitution, because that puts the act of the Congress above the Constitution, which is by definition in a constitutional republic illegal.
Right.
Well, I mean, people don't care about that anymore.
Yeah, but the Constitution is just a piece of paper.
Yeah,
Laws.
exactly.
Are you talking about laws? Laws.
Hey, I'm just saying ought right now. I'm not saying what it is. You're correct on that.
You've skewered me on that before. I'm like, but the Constitution. You're like, no one cares.
That's true.
I mean, it's been since basically nuclear weapons, right? And like, I think that like if you had to be charitable, like you're like, like that's going to happen fast. You know what I mean? So I don't want to have to run through some things through Congress to, like, if I need to surge people to Checkpoint Charlie from back in the day, shout out to all the boomers still alive, listen to this for some reason. Or for you people who don't know Checkpoint Charlie. It was
Hi, Mom. My mom's been to Checkpoint Charlie.
Really? West and East Germany. Google it. You'll be fine. I'm sure. You get all. But if I have to surge troops to Checkpoint Charlie during one of these escalations to the brink, like I don't want to have to go through Congress to get some shit done. You know what I mean?
Right.
But as comes, like, some conflict is not like there's a 1 in the conflict box and a 0. It's a nice spectrum.
Right.
Right.
Well, and the constitutional way to do that would be to say that pass a constitutional amendment that says the president can deploy troops defensively for a certain amount of days, like they did with the War Powers Act, but do it in a legal way rather than the illegal way. Right.
I think the National Security Act was their version of that, so they didn't want to do the amendment thing.
Yeah, right. Well, and they got the wink and the nod from the judiciary, and that's really the weakness. If you're going to criticize the Constitution, the weakness of the Constitution is mutual conspiracy between the elites in D.C. That would say, hey, you could pass this thing. It's obviously not constitutional, but we all know we got to fight the Russians.
Well, history's tricky too, because like we weren't alive, right? To me, Rome falling and 1950. I mean, they're in the same space of I wasn't alive. I don't know what I was doing. I wasn't riding my bike when 9/11 hit, or whatever the fuck it is, right?
Yeah.
That you can do with some of the modern things. And so, like, and again, who knows if this is even true? There's another fact about the meaning crisis we have. Like, well, why would I believe this story versus the story that was buried for how long? But so, like, let's take the Roman Civil War thing. I'm going to go right to the point here. So Constantine wins, right? Augustus wins, right? Calls himself Caesar Augustus. And then he just lives for a really fucking long time. Like, I think he did it like 26. He can check me back there. But something like that, like in the early 20s. And he didn't die until he's like 70. We had 50 years to propagandize your populace about what the truth is, how we do business. So if you can get that far, like we're talking about, man, I really wish I wouldn't have did this in the 50s. Well, it's been around so long that now that's established whatever. This is how we do things.
Right.
Even though we shouldn't have did it that way, we did. And like we went through 3-4 generations already.
Right.
And now we're in our generation. We can't even decide who's a boy and a girl, for fuck's sake. You know what I mean? So how are we going to decide?
No, I think you're right. There's like at a certain amount of point of just ignoring something.
Yeah.
It just becomes part of the institution, right? So we were working on school choice stuff. We just did an interview with Trish, and there's a part of the Montana Constitution says that the government cannot give any private person or business or charity or whatever their money unless they wholly control it. It says that in the Montana Constitution, Article 5, Section 10, or something like that. But that's like, the government does that all the time, right? SNAP, all the welfare programs do exactly that. The government gives you money so that you can go spend it at a corporation. That completely violates the Montana Constitution. But it's been around so long, everyone just kind of goes like, well, yeah, I mean, you can't do school choice because then you'd be able to unaccountably spend your money, but we will subsidize you in all these other ways because they've been around a long time. Therefore, they're good. They're fine. They don't violate the Constitution.
I see. Yeah, I was just to make sure I'm tracking you there. That violates like SNAP, for example, violates the Montana Constitution because you're limited in the places where you can spend SNAP money.
No, it violates it because the government is supposed to own.
It goes through the state.
You're not allowed to give tax dollars to anybody unless the government completely owns it.
Because the state gives the money to them.
Right. It would be like you could get a voucher to then go shop at the state-owned grocery store.
I see.
But that would be compliant as I read the Constitution, but it isn't that. And if I remember right too, there's actually like you can only sue within the first 5 years of something happening with that program as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's in the Montana Constitution.
A statute of limitations to constitutional breach.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Like, we've been doing this for 10 years. It's in the like fuck the
Good enough.
Good enough.
Who needs a constitution? Who needs laws? I'll change them. You know what I mean? I don't like it enough.
So the meaning crisis.
Pause for the cause.
Uh-oh. There you go.
Just didn't want to.
Ad break.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Zesty Beverages. They're on a mission to unf the standard American diet by crafting drinks with fewer calories and more nutrients from real food. Their lineup of delicious offerings now includes Electric Peak Yerba Mate, postbiotic sodas, keto-friendly, ready-to-drink margaritas, and hard teas. Wondering what a postbiotic soda is? Well, head on over to zestybev.com to learn more and find a retailer near you. Once again, check them out online at zestybev.com. That's ZESTYBEV.com.
So the meaning crisis, you mentioned that earlier.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
Oh, it's the greatest thread of our time. Do we not? Do we not think this way? Like
I do. Yeah.
How, like, it's not just what's true. That's already a problem. But like what, like you can't even like go back to the characteristics thing that may or may not have been recorded. Like we drew these lines around these categories. We named the category. Well, then that kind of shifts through time. You know what I mean? Like example, like I don't want to go back to the gender thing, but similar things. Like let's pick something. Like what does war mean? Like what's a constitutional war versus an unconstitutional war? That is clearly morphed.
Versus a kinetic engagement.
Kinetic engagement, right?
we could splice and dice that a lot of ways.
No, advisors, training advisors. You know what I mean? For 50 years.
Yeah.
What's the big deal? You know what I mean?
So what was your point? So like that word breaks down. Like we say war, but then there's a million ways to break that down and get around the potential legal implications.
Because what does it mean? Like, well, we don't really know what it means. What did they mean when they wrote it? What did they, you know what I mean? Like you get, and I don't think like postmodern thought and like there's no truth. I don't like that. I'm not that kind of guy. But I definitely think of when people write, like every story has got a storyteller. Like that person is writing or perceiving in something and they're going to write it. They might synthesize what other people say. But at the end of the day, you are coming from a perspective. Again, like there's more than just, you're not just by yourself. Like the idea doesn't live alone. It lives, how it may have been generated from this person and then it goes through, whatever space you want to call community as we chop and get it up and then it gets inserted into your brain later. Somebody who never even heard about it. Like this is what it means that a constitutional war is. So there's some pockets like this. They might have that distinction, but they go talk to their local friend and they have a completely different distinction. You know what I mean? So like all these different, I guess little cultures that crafted some on the internet, some without it. Like you almost like can't talk to each other, right? You have this ability where you don't mean the same things. So that's one part of it. And then to get to the postmodern really disaster, in my opinion, where there is no truth, only a will to power, straight Nietzsche or something, right? Like there is no such thing as truth. So it's my truth, it's your truth. My truth is I'm, a dolphin, right? Right. You're like
South Park. You're making a South Park reference right now.
I wish I was. I forgot what they used.
It's a dolphin. Yeah.
Is
it's
it?
like there's no dolphin bathrooms in here.
It's like, well, I identify as the person who can determine if you're a dolphin and you're not. You know what I mean? Like, so you can just play these games all over the place. So I think that goes to the meaning crisis a little bit. Is we're having a less of ability to have a coherent ability, even speak to each other, let alone have these bedrock concepts like what's a constitutional war, or when can I violate the Constitution, which are supposed to be never. But like, when can you violate the Constitution and go like, this is okay, kinetic engagement's okay, but invasion, no, don't use the I word.
Yeah,
I mean, we're training advisors. We didn't invade. We are advising how they should invade. That's all.
They should conduct their civil war.
Right, exactly. So that's what I mean. Like you have this issue, and then how like the word of narco-tyranny floats out, and that's how I think I would say it too. Like then there's no standard because the standards are all over the place. So like somebody breaks a law, like it used to be, well, this is the context of the law. This is what it means when it means it. But now it's like, well, who's that person?
Well, the standard is what the authorities tell you.
Well, that's what I mean. We got to that moment.
That's the idea, right? It's like, because there's no common standard that we're currently operating on, then it's like, well, I got to go to whoever has the most authority in the space to let me know how to think about it. Correct?
Yeah, and you do with this in like even like business land. Like you can see, like this is common. This has been happening forever. But hopefully, it gets to the point like I have a contract with this guy, and there's a deliverable due, and it's supposed to look like this, and he's like, it's not there. We're like, that didn't happen. I'm like, no, that totally happened. right. So you totally owe me money. Like, I don't owe you money. Like, but yeah, you do. Right. So you take that small thing, but then you scale that thing on these huge levels. Right. Where you fundamentally don't even agree on reality itself. And then it definitely seems like there's a lot of different factions and camps going on. But that's what I mean by the meaning crisis. It's almost like, not to go biblical, but the Tower of Babel, like everything collapses and then nobody can talk to each other. That's the story there. Like, oh, we all were this one unified, empire of Babylon or whatever. And then it falls apart and then they all get different language they can't speak. Like there's more to that story. I'm not going to go there. Go ask your local priest. But like, as far as like the commonality of it, it's like, I definitely feel like it's getting tougher to even just communicate, because communication goes a little different ways. I always get weirded out when people looking at me, but like the way it works, right? You have a concept and you're going to encode it into language you were trained to use, right? So you're encoding the concept. You already have noise that could be getting in there, right? This is what I think an unconstitutional war is. And now I'm going to say that word, right? Unconstitutional words about come out my mouth. And then you have the whole median, whether it's this podcast or me or sound waves coming to you. Right. And then I have to hear it. I have to hear it clear. First off, that's the noise in the median itself. Yeah. Like somebody could be shutting their door right now and they just missed everything. Right. So now I'm going to completely not hear all the context of what's going on. And that's going to change how I decode what you just said. Right. And then how I understand the concept. Right. So we just have these people that can't even communicate concepts to each other. Right. They don't agree on the truth. We don't agree on all kinds of things.
Right. And that is both like, it's a problem. I see what you're saying is a problem, but it's also an asset, right? Because then it allows us to have we've always had that, right? We just had interesting conversations within a more narrow bandwidth, but the bandwidth has expanded, right? Yep. So you can get people who have found their super niche community online, and now they're super specialized in that space. And then when they talk to them about that nerdy thing that they're into, they sound like an alien, right? You could talk to me and Kyle about D&D, and all of a sudden, we're aliens, right?
You play D&D?
Yeah.
Loves it. Loves it.
Can I try to clarify something here? Because I think I might have been misdecoding what you were saying by meaning crisis. Yeah. Are you speaking about the meaning of words or a person's meaning as in their purpose?
Well,
in
even
life?
like no. Yeah. So meaning
because I can see the associations with how one could affect the other. But I'd like to just hear.
Yeah, definitely. Like I was not referring to the meaning of life, although that's certainly a different crisis. Back to the whole language problem, right?
Yeah. A common meaning of life, right?
So a common narrative, a common truth, a common standard, a common way we can communicate and understand ideas.
Gotcha.
Right.
If I'm hearing right, you're just saying like the language is kind of sub to that, right? So the language barrier is first, and then on top of that sits the common story of us, right? Because we can't have a common story because we can't talk to each other, both because of like the political culture and the way that we deal with conflict as a country. A lot of people probably listened to the whole trans talk at the very beginning and went, not my podcast.
Yeah,
boom. You know what I mean? Because
that part
we
is
might have said on the trigger.
That's going to be our first paywalled content.
Really?
No, I was just daydreaming about that earlier. Well, that might be too spicy for YouTube, so maybe we'll put that.
Well, what I was saying about like the fundamentalness, since we're going to go back to just touch, but like those like some things are fundamental that you receive, and we put a language on it. You know what I mean? We name that thing. Like that's part of what we do to create the order out of the chaos that is the perception we have. Like, yeah, there's a lot of photons coming out, but that's a lamp, that's a camera looking right at me. That's David, who I feel bad about your shoulder. That's Joe, who I appreciate keeping us on track.
Thanks,
man. You know what I mean? So like you can name these things and you see those things. So when people get asked those fundamental questions, like the Supreme Court, right? Hilarious answer, right? But I also feel I have empathy because like, what are you supposed to answer to that? Right. You're supposed to do a laundry list of components? Yeah. Because it's a holistic thing. You know what I mean?
When you say the Supreme Court, you mean like the asking the Supreme Court justice, what is a woman? Or,
yeah, and she said, I'm not a biologist. Well, as a biologist, I will tell you.
Hot take alert. Incoming.
Incoming.
That,
Turn off the YouTube live stream now.
you might have overcomplicated this issue.
Very, very political way to say that.
It might have been overcomplicated.
Oh man. So yeah, I like your way of thinking about it, Adam, because there's, to me, it's going to sound corny, but diversity and tolerance are both assets and liabilities, right? So they're assets to the degree that we have tolerance when we disagree and we are able to suss out where those disagreements come from and how we disagree and learn from one another and exercise openness. And then they're also a liability when we use our disagreements and use the things that we can't speak commonly on, and we kind of get tribalized and religiousized into them.
Yeah.
That's not a word, religiousized, but
I like where you're going with it.
my way into it to the point where we're fighting in the streets over, legislation or over all these kind of things.
Well, take example of public school when I grew up, not to hammer on public school. It's gone off the rails, probably was off the rails before, but I was literally taught as truth that George Washington chopped this cherry tree down and he refused to tell a lie to his parents or something like that. And that made him an American saint. And therefore, you must love America because they have saints like George Washington as their founders. And then you go to now, let's go to, any kind of indigenous movement take. They'll be like, not only did you genocide us all, right? You stuck us on. So what I'm saying is you got narratives that are different.
Yeah.
You go back, even you can read revision, people call it revision history, and they call it that because the narrative they were told that's being taught in institutions, the other sides of it might not have done. So taking the Spanish Inquisition, right? Mm-hmm. You can find a lot of arguments for said Spanish Inquisition based off of the behavior of who was inquisited. Again, it's all awful. Nobody, bloodshed is terrible to me. I hate bloodshed, not like it. Nobody should die ever, but that's not the world we live in. They are going to, and people are awful sometimes, and they gotta be taken care of. But that whole thing, you only heard, well, Catholic priests are murdering all these people who refuse to be Christian. Okay, first off, the Catholic priest didn't do a damn thing. It was the state. So everybody forgets that immediately. No, the crown did that through its stuff. No priest took a thing and burned someone. That did not happen. That's not how they operate. And if they did, they would have been excommunicated because that's just something they don't do. Right? Priests don't shed blood. That's just part of the story. At least the Catholic priests at the time. I don't even think they're allowed to be surgeons. Somebody can look that up. They're not allowed to be surgeons. So it's just the whole story already. It's it's the Catholic Church's fault. So now it's a nice box. And we all know we hate the Catholic Church. Did you remember the boy thing? Right? Remember that thing? So you just, they draw that narrative.
You put that all, you can kind of make the category and you fill it with things that are a narrative, right? They're not necessarily true. They might have elements of truth to it. They might be manipulations, intentional or unintentional.
But they all support that particular worldview of that particular institution.
Right. And to credit stability, and that's no one right, wrong, or different, that narrative held for a long, and still holds in the West a long way. But as you find out that there's actually other sides to the story, again, other side of the American founding story, other side of whatever, then everything starts to break down as far as we built this logic and laws off of these stories. And now we learned, or we now believe in a different story. You know what I mean? So now I think it's unique to the internet because we have so many different avenues, so many different things to share. And I can learn, someone can translate a Buddhist monk in Nepal and has his thoughts about something in English. He probably got that's another thing. Translation might be wrong, and that's a whole different rabbit hole.
Right.
But I might be able to read it. I can read this.
Yeah.
Where good luck doing that 30 years ago. Who could do that?
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think we're uniquely experiencing this kind of our version of a meaning crisis. I think there's been others. I think World War II is a giant example of a giant meaning crisis where what you're doing is so immoral, I'm going to shoot artillery at you till you stop doing it. And vice versa. It's not like they didn't. You go Nazi communists, for example, they're at each other's throats for a while there before they kicked it off, right?
Right. So the what is the solution though? I mean, as far as it looks like the range of solutions I can see is communitarianism, where we're saying everyone needs to break down into smaller communities so that we can have a common language and a common set of meanings, and that will help fill in this crisis that people are having. Or there's kind of the individualist kind of argument, which is we just gotta just keep our hands off and let it evolve and see where we go, and just make sure that we avoid harm. And then the other one is we need to burn down all these institutions because our new story is that these institutions are all evil, right? I would guess that's 3 broad categories. I'm just going to dump them in there, but they're probably not totally accurate. What do you think? I mean, what is the best way to navigate that world?
Ooh, well,
solve.
I will definitely mess up if I declare something's the best. But I guess I tell how I think about it. How I think about it, I'll take some things with my psychologist friends I badmouthed earlier. It's a real science, I promise. So like they have like the concept of Dunbar's number. Like you guys familiar with that? Yeah. You can hold about 150 personalities, for lack of a better word, in your memory recall. So I can know 150 people. Like that's Joe. He does the podcast with David. David is married to Jessica. I'm going to stop saying things I forgot. This is live and other things. You know what I mean? So like this is like I can hold that knowledge about somebody, but not forever. Like I'll run out at 150. And so like the fact that we have so much info bombarding your mind, for lack of a better description, it's very difficult to like that number shifts around. So I lose. Like if I pay attention to other people, speaking of back to attention, if I'm going to pay attention to my family for a while because I need to do some things, I'm going to lose out on all these things other people did. Like I'm just going to lose that stuff. Like that's the problem with the attention component. You only have so much. Like time is linear. I can only focus on one thing intensely at a time. I know you could, be driving and listen to this awesome podcast, but besides those minor things, you still only have so much bandwidth, for lack of a better word, to receive the signals from. And now we got so many. It's not just a noise problem. I think it's more of like independent signals that you're talking about. Like this is our community. We could all live this way. We would all agree, like covenant community, stuff like that. Like that's one angle to it. That's what you're talking about, right? Like, oh, we got these communities, or we got individuals. Like, you know what? Nobody could communalize and do this right. So let's just see what happens.
Yeah. Or I'm going to find my own community. I'm going to find it where I'm at, and we're not going to have to live close to one another. We're not even going to agree on most things, but I'm going to find people I value with, tribalize around that. That's every friend group you probably have.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think this goes to another point of like, you said the religious size. And I like it because somebody like me will say something bold and be like, you can't not have a religion. Like you can pretend you don't, but something's sitting on your mantle. Something that's characterizing the rest, contextualizing the rest of your thoughts. Your morality is derived from what, right? What your value hierarchy is basically, right? And so that value hierarchy, if I said it that way, you could take that model of a value hierarchy and you could put it on every religion, right? Because they all have theirs, and they have different ones as well. Usually when war happens, especially over time, like you're doing something that is so horrific to me. Like take the Spanish conquistadors, which you also learned are the worst people in the world. But the people that they conquistadored were child sacrificing people, and the tribes that were next to them wanted them to, you know what I mean? Yeah. So like, it's not as clean as you like, oh, this nice little box story.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like now you get a lot more ability to see the unclean, and it's kind of hard to understand what actually did happen.
Right. And one of the things is that every time you bring up a revision, right, or a vision of a narrative, it's my personality. I go, yeah. Like I my response to that is always like, that's interesting. That's fascinating. Like there's another side to the story. We're told there's always two sides to a story. There's always, the winner writes the history, and that real, history is this more complex and nuanced thing. We're going to have a quasi-historian, history teacher, quasi-historian's not the right word, history teacher on here soon to talk about that too. But, each one of those things seems like a good thing, but we're kind of talking about it at the same time like it's a bad thing because we can't have a common dialectic.
Well, I think a part of it is the history got pitched as like a scientific adventure, and that's just not what it can be. Because anybody, like example, they got this podcast, and that's going to be history maybe until the server gets deleted, right? And then there's no evidence. So you say, oh, there's no evidence of your podcast that you did. Like, well, like the last one.
Yeah.
Like it might be deleted. Like, how do I know you went in there? You know what I mean? So like, you just don't, you have this evidence-based only logic, which again, makes a lot of sense from the Enlightenment values we had. I say had because we were certainly post-Enlightenment, but like you know what I mean? We are post-Enlightenment.
No, definitely. Yeah.
Right. But they tried, so they wanted to go about it in that way.
Right.
Right. And that was, that's the 18th century German philosophy, which again, like that was great for when it worked. But now, especially now with the internet and all the different abilities to get messages out, like you got a connected global system now with info, which you had. It's just slower, but now it's like hyper fast.
Well, I mean, I would argue that isn't that the Enlightenment though, right? So like it's just in a different expression of the same thing, right? What we're talking about is people's ability to look at the same phenomena, test against it, and then come up with different conclusions, and then suss that out using other Enlightenment institutions like free speech and science. And
I don't disagree with that's the Enlightenment. When I say post-Enlightenment, I say the power resides in people who don't think that way anymore. So that's why I would say post-Enlightenment, because yes, there's still Enlightenment-based principles. Like I have also, I'm not a very big fan of some of the Enlightenment stuff, but I still agree there's an objective truth out there to reference.
Yeah.
Right? Because how do you rationalize without an objective truth reference?
Well,
how are you reasoning without two different things?
Right.
How are you coming up with that stuff? But when it comes to like some things you can like the measurement of things, like say I'm measuring the brain, like I can get this biomarker, but it's not indicative of the entire cognitive process. So I'm going to miss a lot.
Sure.
And so there's more things, like there's a lot more unmeasured than measured. And especially in something like history. Like if you're only going to go off of like, oh, like it has to have been written down and it has to be whatever. Well, the farther back you go, the more fucking noisy that is, or more confusing that is. Right. And then again, like what sources hold value? Like this source is so value, like the New York Times is the value, right? Because they will get the story right. It just happens to be 2 years later and they can point to it. Because even in the 30s, they were not that angry about Hitler, if I remember my New York Times hilarity, right?
Definitely not Time magazine, right?
Right.
He was person of the year at Time.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like, oh, we'll recognize the awful, or we'll get the story right. It's just going to be after we've done our propaganda purpose. You know
so
what I mean?
I would, quick distinction, and we're getting really nerdy here, but between the Enlightenment, empiricism, and rationalism, right? So in the Enlightenment is a whole set of values that are like the state should be separate from church, to free speech, to free markets, to like a whole bunch of institutions that are kind of all wrapped into the Enlightenment values. What it seems like to me, what you're talking about is the empiricism has limits, right?
Yeah.
And so you need rationalism on some level. Rationalism is the easiest way is Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. I'm going to start with,
which I would dispute, but continue.
Yeah. Is that that you strip down to first principles and then build your worldview up from those principles, which I think you're actually agreeing with, right? You're saying that there are certain things that are sub language that I have to operate on, and then reference to, from other people's giving me my identity, or from my values, from my community. Each of these things are prior to evidence, right? These have to exist in order for me to even observe evidence.
Well, yeah, you can't measure anything unless it's named. That's one issue, right? And so that a lot of times there's, again, when you go to the soft sciences, for lack of a better word, very soft.
Ouch.
Super soft.
Super soft sciences.
Most of them are soft too. Not a lot of Chad social scientists.
Hey, I'm a political scientist over here. Ouch, bro. Ouch.
I mean, you consider I'm sorry. There's I said not very many.Id I say zero? Did I say zero? Has anybody got a recording?
Ouch.
About zero?
I'll check the record.
He's calling me out.
Not very many. So you're in the top 1%. You're the 1% of Chadistan soft scientists.
I don't think I've ever called myself a political scientist.
I didn't even heard that come out your mouth until right now when you got offended.
It's technically a degree I have, but yeah.
You're very offended by my soft. People are soft in soft science. There's not a lot of Chad.
It's the softness more than the soft science.
That's what they're called. By us.
Yeah.
By the hard science people.
We measure neurons. Get out of here.
Look at me. I'm measuring electricity. That's pretty real. Yeah, you're measuring bad feelings. How's that? What's a bad feeling? Explain that to me. I know what electricity is.
Wow, we went off the rails. Sorry.
That's going to be a great clip.
It really is. Yeah. I'm sitting over here as the marketer, like, just leave me out of this.
What was the question? No, I know what your question is. So to me, I think what you're getting
I'm trying to put you in categories. So will you operate with my categories for a minute so I can understand you? It's just that came off way more harsh than I meant it to. I just
I'll fit your box. Yeah, no problem.
I'm like,
what box do you want me to be in?
3 different categories.
Well, so we'll go Aristotle, because I know you're a philosopher too, right?
Yeah.
There you go. So what Aristotle, he described it as there's episteme, where you can just demonstrate the thing. That's where hard science definitely lives. Like I don't know, if I poke this thing, it's gonna move. See, poke, move.
Animal.
Right. I mean, you can base stuff off of that, and then you have the doxa component. Like I can't reproduce this as more of an opinion, and that's usually like a higher scale thing. Like we can measure the material, sure, but how they all fit together in that web of relationships kind of tends to be a doxa part, right? So that's where I would separate those two. where I think a lot of people went off.
Define doxa one more time.
It's like opinion. Doesn't mean you can't have a right opinion.
Yeah.
Like, how do I say it this way? Like, if you take a look at a bunch of data, which has nice visuals, but I don't. Like, think of a scatter, like you shot a shotgun against a door. So you got all these different points. And say that's your data, right? Well, the story you write through the data, that line that you see in all the papers, like that's a story. That's like how that I'm contextualizing the data. I'm telling you what the data says. Right. So that's usually a higher level. Like I never dispute data per se. I might dispute how it's collected and then the lines they draw through it. That's their story. That's a narrative about it. Right. And so that narrative component to it, like based off of that data, this might be the most reasonable curve fit of this model. Let's use model language. Like, oh, this is the best model fit based off of the data I measured. Right. And then because it looks like this, based off of other loose concepts, I can say that, oh, it relates to other things this way. But once you get to that spot, that's the opinion piece of what's going on. So you have like, oh, I collected this data. This was my methods, right? So I'm doing episteme. This is the methods. If you do this, you're going to get this kind of data set. And so that data set might be very scattered, not very tight, right? It might be complete. And so that, when you get data like that, I mean, good luck.
Yeah. You're just saying there's no correlation.
But they have to.
Yeah.
Like that's like how the fields work. You have to say something, right? It was part of the issue, right? And so when you're talking about the enlightenment piece, like I think people did that effort of like, we can measure in episteme more things than they could. And then when they turned out they couldn't reproduce them, like again, my psychologist friends, like 50% or more unreproducible, right? Unreproducible stuff. So that, I mean, you just see that in action, right? Or you can draw multiple lines through the data. Like, oh, it turns out you can do a model where there's actually 4 lines and they go like this. And this is why, again, like you have that way to talk about things. Right. But at the end of the day, the how it fits into the whole like cosmology of you, like that kind of has to go to doxa because you just don't have the information to demonstrate it over and over and over. I hope that made sense.
It got complicated, but I like it.
That's right.
If you reference Aristotle and Plato in a podcast, 3 million downloads. You know what I mean?
True.
Right?
True.
Right?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That's why I've been trying to insert Plato into our podcast lately. I think you're right.
And call David soft. I didn't even try. This guy beats me up in the mat. I'm like, yeah, you're soft as shit. You soft.
That's
scientist.
not the current record, my friend. You're up on me. That's for sure.
Well, injuries do count, so I'm going to take it. In real life, you'd just be dead.
Adam, we went so far into this without really knowing who the heck you are. Can you give us like the top level view of who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about?
Oh man. So I'm Adam Thuen. I've been living here in Montana since about 2016. Before that, I was in the Army. So I retired Army. I did some work with conventional operations, did a deployment with them. Then I moved over to special operations and discipline called civil affairs, did a deployment with them. Did some other couple non-combat deployments. Back went to hell, knees went to hell. Army said, you're done. I said, I can be done. That sounds great. And then I went and got a neuroscience PhD from Montana State. Finished with that. And then, I like the community we live in a lot. Turns out there's not a lot of, they shut down the department. So that was really a problem. So future opportunities in neuroscience, although that might change. For now, what I've been doing the last 2 years is consulting with small businesses doing, the best way I can characterize it is I do a combination of like project management, data engineering, and just general consultation on like tech stuff. So example, I build like systems. Like let's take the system. It's like, okay, there's data we can catch with this system if we tweak it this way and it can talk to this system and we can get data like that. And then how do we use this to inform some of your decisions? Like I really want to know X. It's like, okay, that's great. But we're going to need to do some work to actually get data that matters. So what's kind of nice about that whole trajectory is like in the special operations civil affairs world, especially, a lot of what you're trying to do is figure out how to even tell that what you're doing is working, right? Because it's so like esoteric in a lot of ways. Like, oh, okay, we want to accomplish these objectives, and we want to put this project together and fund it with these people and doing this thing. But what is the real objective for the DoD? So this is like the one-liners: leverage civilian assets on the battlefield for DoD objectives. Like, okay, the DoD wants less violence here, which is always good. So if we employ people, hypothetically, right? So then you can get concentrated on the jobs. Like we employed 100 jobs. So therefore I did a good job, but there was 1 million murders. Like, so maybe you didn't do a good job because your job was to get less murders. You know what I mean? So it's also clarifying what data matters and what doesn't matter, which is actually more of a military. I'd say they're better at that. That should scare people than the science world half the time. Like what data is worth the fuck? Because in the science world, you kind of like you have to publish or you're going to go down. So you get down these experiment rounds and these rabbit hole investigation trains, like you're going to finish the work. And again, it's how you characterize it. So some people, that's where you get all these like fake data and all this pressure to do those kinds of things. And again, like what your question is and how you're measuring it tells way more about your data than what you're actually getting out of, as far as like that story I was talking about earlier, right? So the military component was like, okay, what is actually worth a shit to measure? And like what is an effective measure and what is a measured performance? That's how we usually broke those down. So in that example I did, we employed 100 people. That was our measure of performance. We're performing, and that has the effect of what? Well, the murder rate went down. And then the other part about that is, and like this is where the science comes a little bit more like, okay, so because the military will jump to a conclusion immediately, like, well, that's because we got to kill somebody, right? Let's put a packet together and go raid. Like, so they just can't wait to do that. That's just what they love. So like a raid is always the answer for the Army, right? But there might be another reason the murder rate is going up or down. And so that like investigating that and like finding another, place to inquiry that. But as far as like in the last 2 years, like in helping out small businesses, kind of, I like to use the word modernize a little bit. Like a lot of information technology is too fast for a lot of people. Like some of these businesses have been around for, 5-10 years, but the last, 5-10 years, they've been, strap hanging and getting it. They're survived COVID, right? They're still around. But now all this tech, there's AI, there's all this stuff. Like, how do I use this stuff? I don't even understand how it works. I don't understand what I can use. And again, for most people, Excel is actually what you should stick with. But if you get more advanced, like you can certainly, leverage data a little bit, or at least see how you can build systems where you can build a little bit more evidence into your decisions instead of straight gut. But, gut's underrated sometimes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, you operate on gut, but you got to make decisions on,
Yeah. Somebody gave me a line once where they said, well, like, how did you come up with this course of action? And they're like, well, it's how we felt was good. He's like, oh, good. Well, if we're going to operate on gut feeling, it's going to be mine. So next time, bring me data with your gut feeling. So,
how would you define gut feeling? What is that physiologically?
Cognitively. That's a very meta question.
Well,
yeah, your belief on what's like what would be a good thing to do at that moment. Like if I do this action, I think like a gut feeling in the sense of like, oh, I should come in and do this podcast because it'd be really fun to do something. I have a good feeling about it, but what's my evidence about that? I got
what backs it? I mean, a lot of people, I think you get this connotation that gut feeling is this very like kind of just esoteric, like, well, I just felt like it. It's just out of nowhere. But there are neurons all throughout the body, are there not? Through the heart and the digestive system. Like, are those neurons at work when you're listening to your gut?
Ooh, that's a big. I'll crack the worm. I'll crack the can of worms.
Let's go.
All right, let's crack it. So, yes and no. All right, that's fun. So at the end of the day, yes, you are gonna like that signal is gonna collapse into a motor function, or like you're gonna act. You're gonna move. Right, you're gonna do something. Right, you're gonna talk. Like whatever. Right, something's gonna be the end. So there's an end state where that happens. So like I am executing my gut feeling. Let's talk about the gut feeling. So you got all these sensory inputs, right? So the ones you already know, like you got your audio, you got your visual, you got touch, and like the classics, right? So you're getting all this data for the now, right? So this is also part of your information stack that's coming in. I'm in this room, and my gut feeling is I should do better about explaining this. You know what I mean? So like I'm getting all this information and I'm like measuring in real time, but also there's a lot of subconscious. That's the words they use. Subconscious is another can of words we won't go into. But like a lot of that area where subconscious activity, like it's not what people would like to like neat box. Like, oh, my cortex thinks and my croc brain just doesn't think. Yeah. But in reality, they're all interconnected all over the place. But a lot of like gut biomes, like gut biome neurons, they all like all these things, all these body things will terminate at the brain stem, right? And those are interconnected throughout the cortex, right? So yes, they are involved in some kind of information synthesizing way. But as far as like why we call it a gut feeling, why did the ancients call it a heart when they mean your whole body or something? Like people have come up with these things like body parts associated with things. Everybody even looked at Chinese medicine. They got, you know what I mean?
But there's a physiological reason, right? Because you're in that moment where you got to act and you get that
Yeah, I feel that gut feeling like, oh,
Yeah.
my stomach tightens up because I
Yeah.
think that some of that's I think
Is it logical? You're about to fight, right? It's like,
yes,
it's like a,
my adrenaline got dumped in the system. Like I'm not that kind of
Right.
biologist, but like I would guess so. Like as you're acting, like, oh, this is an intense situation. I've assessed this situation's intense. I'm about to act, right? Dump a bunch of hormones or whatever, endocrine system going. Like we're tightened up, we're ready, right? And then you're gonna execute. Or when you're talking about a decision, like I'm gonna feel in my body that if I do this thing, or you're about to do this thing, I got in my gut that you should just not do this. You know what I mean? Like, so that it's a colloquial way to talk, but I definitely think it's experiential based. Again, that goes back to our first question, like the language, or first thing I like to talk about. The language piece is always second to me. Like it's not fun. Like language isn't fundamental. The concept is, right? So that's how we're articulating. Like, oh, I feel in my gut, right? It's really just my body ready to go. That's a quick bookend answer. Right?
I like it. Yeah.
I don't know.
yeah. So we met you reached out to me because you were doing some work with the Libertarian Party back then.
Yeah,
And
that was
that's
a
why
while
we
ago.
met, yeah.
I'm post-political now, but continue.
Yeah. So you were doing that. And then, well, I would like to talk about that. So like we met because you were doing some stuff with the LP. And then I was, I'm obviously always doing work in politics. And so I was like, hey, I want to get some in what the LP's got going on. We met. Became good friends. Obviously, we got together at a Christmas party, and I said you should do jiu-jitsu with me, and you were like, "Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it."
So he became a training partner in jiu-jitsu, and then, but tell me, like you kind of dropped out of the political thing, other than obviously defend the guard, and now you're on a political podcast, so you're not out. You're not out. You're just
I know.
modified.
I'm adjacent. Well, I don't know if you can really be out of politics. It goes back to what I'm saying. Like, I don't think you really separate those in your head. Like, I obviously care about what policies the community makes me adhere to, or ideas of what I think they should be. The question is, what do I do with that? What's my gut feeling about what to do?
Yeah.
They bring it back, but like, why did I leave, or why did I drift away?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is just thinking over like some of the things I talk about. If I said what I said probably 5 years ago, I'd be like, that's not like, I don't know what do you mean enlightenment was something different? Like it's crazy. So I think some of that is part of it. Just like I'm not a really big fan of, I guess the idea of, how do I always say this poorly to really make you angry? If we're gonna jits it. Like the old way to call liberalism, like say, like I don't like what the fruits of it have been, and I would say it's more causal than I think people don't want to register. And so I think a lot of people's like, well, these are definitely pathologies, so we need to remove them and get back to the basics, and hopefully that makes it work out. And I would say, well, maybe that can happen, but this already happened. Right. So it's like, it's tough for me to say, I know for sure that if this was the set of the environment, that these good fruits would come out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I guess I got to somewhere where I go more ancient in the sense of like, I'll use this as a standard for what truth is and assess the political things after that. I guess I just put a different thing on my mantle. If that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. In fact, Kyle agrees with you a lot. He's like grinning over
Are you
there.
like
He's just like,
post-libertarian? Are you one of these?
I know, like pretty much everything that you've put as your framework of the way you think is very similar to how I frame things, with like data and narratives, kind of like this Nietzschean analysis of like the death of God and the meaning crisis. Like all those types of things are very much, and post-libertarian might be a way to describe that.
I mean, that's what phrase I've heard.
yeah.
I mean, I was a libertarian and now I don't
Yeah, like, and I
do
still
that. But
I still
was I
operate
ever a
with the
libertarian? I don't know what that
framework.
means. I didn't
Well,
even vote for libertarian before. So I was like, what does that mean?
Well, I think, okay, so to me, the test is very simple. Do you believe that there are situations where people can morally use force against someone else that is non-defensive? And then do you make an exception for government and when?
When they castrate children.
Well, and if you say that is
what I
an
would say.
aggression or manipulation,
that's me.
I think you can be a libertarian and believe that. Because if anything, you gotta be like, for example, like I don't know, I think we record this part, but you're like, some of those things in the trans space that you're particularly concerned about, you're not necessarily want to go after people who have transitioned. You're more like there's manipulation going on. There's fraud going on.
I consider them victims, and like not to the point where I want to harp on that victim status. I mean, like I think that people need to go back to like not just accepting who they were born, but understanding the beauty that was what they like. That as a thing is so great.
But that's like That's like a liberal's point of view on that issue, right? Because you're saying
so I can't fit in a box.
Yeah, exactly.
You can make me fit in a box.
Exactly.
This guy who wants me to fit in this box.
No, I know. That's actually what I appreciate about it. It's the non-boxness that makes me, especially in this space, because like you've said, identity is very, very hard. It's very emergent and it's hard to nail down. It's magic, right? So the true authenticity is the claim for that space and be able to recognize somebody as an individual and the dignity that comes with being an individual, right? And you're saying there's something inherent there that you want to recognize, while saying there's a manipulation here that these doctors are doing that could really harm somebody, and there's a just use of force there. I don't see what's incompatible with that.
Well, I'm not saying it is. I'm sure there's things we can get to. I guess so. To me, I would like, I'm gonna steal somebody's characterization of it. That's fine. I don't even know who it is. Maybe it's Talib or something like that. But like, depending on scale, like, so if we talk about the global system, I'm an anarchist almost. Like, I don't want a global empire, although we got one. And there've been empires in the past, like British Empire before us or whatever, French before them, Spanish. Yeah. So like that behemoth has always been there in some way, right? Rome before that, right?
At different times. There's multipolar periods.
Of course, there's mostly multipolar if you just consider East Asia, because they just didn't engage. Yeah. Right. So I guess what I'm talking about is like there is that level where I would love, and I look at it like I want anarchy in that scale, because I don't want any small region, Britain Island running the whole place. That doesn't like that. So you scale down to the federal level, like I'm more of a libertarian at that federal level. I don't want the government to really dictate individually what people are going to do. I'm sure there's exceptions you can make for, like, I'm sure we can hypothesize those and talk about those. And then you go down one more, and like, oh, okay, so in my state, I want it to be more Republican. I want these different areas of the state, like especially a state like Montana, there's just different areas of different resources, different cultures even inside Montana. Like, it'd be great if they can have more Republican context. Get down to my city, maybe more of a Democrat. I want these things to go more of like, okay, I want this public works project to go. Yes, we're all going to pay for it. I don't care if you don't want to pay for it, Jerry. Like, you're going to pay for it because you're going to use it. We all know you're going to use it. I just want to opt out. And like, no, you're not, Jerry. You're going to flush your toilet like everybody else. You know what I mean? And they get to my house and I'm a communist. You know what I mean? Or I get to my street, I'm a socialist. My neighbors, I get to my house, I'm a communist. Or actually, I'm a dictator at that point. Like, I'm saying what's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen. So I guess I would say it can scale, and I do think it matters on what the issue is. I think it's tough not to say that's true. Yeah. But that's how I would say it now. I don't know.
The attribution there is Naval Ravikant.
Is it Naval Ravikant?
That's right.
I would wager. I bet it's even before then.
I mean, probably so, but
yeah,
that is.
There's a thing called. If I were going to really throw, I think I saw it in like Principal Politica or something close to that, which is a nice little essay. You should read that essay. You might like it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's got
awesome.
Yellowstone wolves in it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he references Yellowstone wolves as far as like they'll create their own territories, and they do.
Oh, and they stay within them, and they kind of create borders.
So more of like, I do think community is inherent. I think that's like you're an individual in a community, and so I definitely have caution about elevating the individual attributes and concerns higher than community in a lot of cases. And I think depending on where that is, where we fight.
What rubric do you use to distinguish each from each?
Like, let's say something like,
when does the let me say that in a less nerdy way.
Yeah.
For the audience, what standards do you use to determine when the community interest goes first versus when the individual is first?
I mean, that's a good question. So I'll answer with examples of that, because this is what's happened. Like the jab issue, right? I was a big, like, don't do this. Like, don't force me to take something. And for me at the time, I was like, well, like me and my own hubris, but I'm so certain you are not certain about this. I am so certain you do not know what the fuck you're talking about that I want to refrain. Yeah. Right. And the fact that you're willing to eliminate livelihoods for people, and it gets to a certain level where they become statistics. Like when individuals become statistics like that bothers me. Now let's flip to the other issue that I seem to care about, which is the child castration thing. And I will call it that because that's what it is. But like that, I don't like. I think the community should step in and stop that stuff. I don't care if the individual parents want it. I don't care if this, because it's too destructive. It's a destructive way, and it's doing things that are not reversible. It's sterilizing people. And I just don't think we should do those things. That's me. And that's more of my other mantle thing. Like, well, life is precious, right? We shouldn't remove these things, from people. And the same reason I don't like abortion. Like, we shouldn't remove that life from things against the potentiality of that life. Because that life has a potential and you're just getting rid of all of it. Like it's never going to manifest if you do this. And so those types of things, I'm like, well, I don't like that.
Yeah.
So let me go King George. But if you try to stick a needle in my arm, I'm a fucking anarchist. You know what I mean? It's just like, I'm not consistent.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be consistent either. It's just like that's not a good rubric. So I don't think I'd have a good standard. If you really had put me on the spot, I'd be like, well, I try to do my best to, combine all my current zeitgeist issues and bounce it against my theology and try to come up with the best moral framework and advocate. But I'm not a big activist. I'm not really trying to change things. I did go testify for Defend the Guard because I thought I was more suited to help in that way. And maybe people want to say, so maybe it's what I think I'm good at talking about, but also I got a lot of issues myself. I got to take care of my family. Yeah. I got to focus on those things. Hang out with my friends, do the podcast.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to set you up as like...
Tell me how to do it.
You're a thought leader now, right? You're on the podcast. So
thought leader?
Yeah.
So is that a title? Is there a cup? Do I get a cup?
Very influential.
We'll put a title card next to
it. It's actually a piece of flair. It's
a flair?
Yeah, it's flair. It goes on your clothing.
Can have a name tag.
But I appreciate that. One of the things that I find is smart people in my life, like yourself, that think different and approach things from a unique point of view. And a lot of times, most people are always in the place where they're trying to make it coherent with everything else they believe. And you have a coherence, right? Your coherence is trying to negotiate between, your political leanings and where you've been politically, your theology, your faith, and like your community and where you're actually at, your status in the world, right? And everyone's always trying to negotiate between these kind of dynamics and trying to sort out
it's hard
how best to unify those different parts.
And it's hard to, like, these are meta questions, but they're important. Like, when is war okay?
Yeah.
And so, like, in some cases, and I would argue the same, it's never okay, but at some point you don't let them do what they're doing. You know what I mean? Like, okay, they're going to come and they're going to kill like Genghis Khan. I'm going to come and kill every one of your children. I'm going to make your women slaves, children slaves, kill every one of your men, and you will never exist again. Right. And this is going to happen.
Right.
And so there's some morality in not shedding their blood.
Yeah.
Right. But there's also a lot of not morality in letting them do that, especially when you can stop it.
Yeah.
Right. So I just think it's damaging in both ways, just lesser two evil kind of mentality on that point. Like, this is not good to shed blood. This is not good. It's not it's inhuman to kill another human most of the time. There's usually pathologies to it, especially in modern day. People can look at that up all they want. There's plenty of people that are good examples of that. But, that doesn't mean there's not time to fight. Like, maybe you fight, but you don't go looking for the fight. I think that's a very libertarian thing to say. Right?
Yeah. No,
like, I'm ready to fight. I'm not going to go look for a fight.
Right. I think it's also very Christian, right? It's very much like, you might orientate yourself to be meek while actually still sharpening your sword, right? There's still like that component of you that is trying to seek a peaceful life, to be a warrior in a garden. And then there's another part of you that sometimes has to go to war.
Yeah, wise as serpents, gentle as doves, right? Like, I am going to sharpen my stick because I know what the serpents are up to, but I'm going to try not to use it.
Yeah.
But that mean I won't, because I'm not a dove or a serpent. I'm a human, and these guys are coming for our kids. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, like, we're going to do something about this, So I don't know. That's not a very crisp answer, but that's close.
I love it. It's a good answer.
Well, I think one way too, talking about the kind of, are you a libertarian or not type of thing, is like, a lot of the general Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism thing, like, those are very useful moral frameworks to kind of have, but they're not like absolutes, right? Like, they're useful to kind of ingratiate into your worldview, but they might not be like, sometimes you're not going to be, sometimes the nap isn't necessarily always going to fulfill every need you need, right?
Right.
Well, it's definitely not going to tell you what to do. Right. Well, it's going to tell you maybe what not to do in a very important range of phenomena.
What's aggression?
What's aggression?
Am I aggressing on someone when I call them the wrong pronoun? Is that aggression?
I think
some people would say yes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's why it gets fuzzy. Like, what, like, this is the meaning Christ. Like, what do you mean by that word?
Well, we put micro in front of the wrong pronoun. That micro very specifically says, whatever I'm saying after this is bullshit.
Yeah.
Technically. So if I say, no, what's another micro dash something? The only one I can come up with, I couldn't say on YouTube. So,
Well, the lexicon keeps changing.
this is why it's going on locals.
Well, it's like Orwell said, that we were going to kind of come into this tyranny of meaningless words. Like, and that's what you're saying right now is like all the categories are confusing and they're all different. None of us are participating in the same definitions of things anymore, and we all talk past each other because of it.
Well, that's also like, that is not necessarily a new problem, right? There's always been lawyerism, right? There's always been legalism. There's always been people who've been parsing words in order to try to get their personal politics or power interests into an existing doctrine to change the doctrine, right? In my point of view, right, what you want is both like the standard and a negotiation mechanism to suss out what a common belief is. Right. So, for example, you might have a law and then you have an adversarial process to negotiate the law to see if it applies in an individual circumstance. That's the old liberal Enlightenment way to think about how to negotiate out a truth, whether or not someone broke the law. The same thing on truth on the macro scale for free speech is that you have these different interests that are attempting to articulate the truth as clearly as possible, maybe using different language, maybe saying microaggression is the same as a punch in the face. Yeah. Well, a lot of people are going to be like, people are going to disagree. So there's that process of free speech. If everyone is motivated to get to the truth and not motivated by power, then you can arrive at persuasion and larger trends kind of taking over and people being able to arrive at something approaching not a like absolute truth, but something that is operable as a truth that works for the social order because you've sussed out the alternatives.
Yeah, we're not, well, I mean, like I think I said it to you earlier today, like the slightness of everything. Like when people put together the phrases, like let's take the dam in Russia, because I know you guys like talking about foreign policy, right?
Yeah.
Like you get a guy who's like, there's no way, I think you remember what I'm talking about, there's no way artillery can blow up a dam. I'm like, the fuck, there's not. I could blow it up right now. Somebody give me a 777. I'll put that sucker sideways. I'll blow a fucking hole so big through that thing that you will feel stupid. And then let me add some things that sound logical after that. Like, therefore, it has to be this thing.
Has to be the Russians.
Has to be the Russians.
Literally setting themselves up to destroy their own dam and territory they control in Ukraine so that they can then starve their own people. Right, and flood their own controlled territory.
It's
like
genius
it makes zero sense
genius
at all.
It's 10 level, 10D chess. But there's the other part of it. I'll go devil's advocate real quick. Like, it could have been the Russians did something they fucked up or something. Like maybe there was a sapper running. I'm just making shit up. But maybe there's a guy with a bag of explosives, trips and falls, fuses too far together, explodes. They're like, oh shit. Like, like, how do we get? But then this is like this happened in Afghanistan too, where you had an incident go down, and then the info war is on. Like, how do we contextualize this event? How do we draw the line through the data and then tell everybody the line story, which is usually what happens in science. That's what you're getting is the line. You don't get to see the data because it's very, esoteric to some people and, detail based. You don't get that. You get usually the story. Like the science says, right? The favorite phrase, right?
Yeah, the science says,
the favorite phrase.
So the experts at the Pentagon say.
Well, I mean, that's this guy again. Like, I'll bash him because I think it's bullshit. It's a straight propaganda piece, and I know the guy goes to Langley and makes speeches, and like, it's just clear that he's one-sided in this. Again, that's great. It really could have been the Russians. I'm not saying that's not possible. Obviously, it's possible, but it's definitely possible to blow up a dam with artillery.
Well, we also have no account. We also have no account of how the Ukrainians did it. Is there existing artillery within range that they actually possess? All evidence we don't have, but the fact that the Pentagon so quickly leapt to it was the Russians, and in the middle one, that's the absurd part. That's the frustrating part, right? They arranged the story to fit their books.
Yeah, I mean, people want to. They're bad. Yeah, they're the worst thing in the world, and. One guy liked Donald Trump once, so they should all die, right? I mean, there are people that, they wouldn't say that, but they act like that's what they believe. You know what I mean? Right. So, I mean, yeah, it's difficult, but that's that little slight, like they just could declare the absolute. Go back to the absolute. They declare the absolute. That's fake, and then rationalize against it. But they do it in such everything's like small. It's like what, 10 words in a picture? Enough, right? You get how many people that subscribe to said person. See that for 3 seconds. They're busy with their lives. That's their little bit of attention for that moment. And now they're going to perceive the world through this standard. The Russians flooded their own people. That's how bad they are. So when negotiations come, 2 years later, they get to say, well, they flooded their own people, and they'll still believe it when they're trying to get this, even for the election in 2 years. Like
Right.
there might be a narrative that comes, or the fucking fake groups out of wherever, right? The Coeur d'Alene thing I sent you too. Like these guys, they have pictures of 2 years ago they did this protest, right? And now there's new stories being written, opinion pieces, doxa pieces, for those that are not paying attention, doxa pieces, and they use this footage as if it was actually like it just happened. Like it becomes, that's the info op. Let me create this. Maybe it's not fake. Maybe they convinced a bunch of idiots to do this, but they did it for this reason, to get this photo, get these images, get these videos that I can now paint over other data. Right? Here's a great story, and let me paint this over this.
What you're kind of saying is that there isn't. It's an interesting point, right? Because it's not necessarily centralized. It's not like narrative control happens because there's some shadowy group saying this.
Right.
It's more like there's a set of interests and incentives that then shift our common, lack of meaning or common language and a lack of, accountability within the system to push everything in a singular direction. To say, hey, we have this article about this news story. We don't have any compelling imagery, so we're just going to take these pictures from 2 years ago, ham it onto there, and make it seem like that's what happened. To you and me, obviously, it looks like a manipulation. To them, it's just, well, we're just putting images together. Or these are all relevant things.
What's the big
deal? Right? Or that guy basically making his argument, off his keister, on the dam. What standard is he actually using to make that point? It doesn't matter, right? Because the Russians have to be at fault because they're the bad guys, right? So it fits his books previously, and everyone who's following him, it's already fixed their books. And the question is, for the listeners, how do you navigate that world better?
Listen to the Liberty Portal podcast is one way to do that, right? Isn't that why we're here?
This guy's a great promoter. I like him.
Get in front of microphones and talk to your friends.
And hope that people listen to it.
Yeah, they will. Somebody will.
That's a good question. How do you make sense of that? How do you distinguish more accurately, fact from fiction?
I mean, you want my no bullshit heuristics now? If it comes from a screen, I don't believe a damn thing it says unless it's my friend that I can verify as him. And I think that problem's going to get worse because we are already there where you can get a number. It's not going to be your number yet, but one day it will be, where it's like David's calling, and then voice comes in my ear hole and then I do something, right? Like, oh, okay, oh yeah, oh, it's David. And then it wasn't you at all. It was some fucking thing trying to get me to do a thing. And now they got the little, you know what I'm talking about? Like
that's
fake,
already
deepfakes.
Like deepfakes. Okay, all right.
But deepfakes
It's already happened.
No, but in a weaponized way where it's to the individual. Like you got my kid for 2 seconds on the iPad.
It's already
now
happened.
I know it's just going to get worse. That's why I say if it comes from a screen, including this podcast, just be ready to meditate on it, ruminate on it a little bit, see if you can, discern a little bit better. Not just, let me quick, if you get to the Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, anybody remember that book? But
Great book.
Don't use your heuristic 1, do the heuristic 2 on purpose, right? Yeah. But not everybody's got time for that too. So that's another problem. It's just that you're busy. Like attention is demanded everywhere, right? All the time. You're just getting bombarded with stimulus all day.
Right. Yeah. So real quick, thinking fast is your quick heuristics, like your reactions, kind of like your automatics.
Yeah, you can fight.
Right. 2 + 2 = 4, right? Like that sort of thing. But I say square root of 91 and you're like, I got to get out a piece of paper. That's thinking slow, right? Yeah. And it's like engaging that deeper part of the brain for thinking carefully or unpacking or trying to resist the quick models that allow you to think quickly, right? So you have basically a quick model set that allow you to really quickly screw something in, right? And get an idea across or act or conceptualize in the world. And then you have the other way, which is more like designing the machine that makes you, that you can override those things. But what you want to do is make sure that your beliefs, maybe to summarize what you're saying, make sure that your beliefs that you hold close to yourself are the things you've thought slow about. And the things that you're not so sure about, then you thought fast about, you kind of keep them at arm's length and allow them to, you can think about them, you can keep them out there, but you want to make sure they're not the sort of things that you treat as the things that you believe in, right? You can play with it, you can entertain it, you can have it be a thing without buying into a singular narrative about it, unless you have a narrative that you've really thought through. So for me, the narrative I've really thought through, spent a lot of time on, my belief about self-ownership or individual rights or spontaneous order processes or stuff like that, the economy, things like that I thought I hold that one close. But then for me to just kind of put a point on it, like the trans issue stuff that we've been talking about, or other sorts of issues, I kind of hold those out a little bit further because I don't have a lot of conviction about it because I want to think slowly about it. I haven't been able to integrate it to where I'm like, I don't want to operate on heuristics on it.
I don't want a black pill, but I will.
Yeah.
So Kahneman and Tversky, they won like a Nobel Prize for behavioral economics, right? Prospect theory, which, to quote some people I used to work with, that is not a falsifiable theory, so therefore it's garbage. But I mean, it's pretty good.
What is this theory? I'm not
prospect theory. You never heard of prospect theory?
No.
Basically,
for the listeners.
For the listeners. So prospect theory, real quick, that is terrible, and you need to look it up yourself, is you will weigh things in a negative outcome will weigh higher than a positive outcome. Does this make sense? Coming back to you?
Yeah.
Right? So the other part of that book was really talking about the system 1, system 2, and system 1 can override system 2, and system 2 can override system 1. It's just not in the ways you might like. And I think Kahneman did an interview not that long ago. Somebody can look it up and, maybe it's not real. But what I heard is that I heard this from him. They're like, how can you stop this? Like, just like you're asking me, how should you stop it? And he's like, I can't. That's it. I can't.
Yeah.
That's how you work.
Yeah.
So know that and try your best, I guess. But I think that's part of it. That's where we get into the whole meaning crisis, why it's so terrible, because I don't think we can reconstruct a narrative quickly now that the other one is broken down. And I think, if an historian here, you can ask him next week, I guess, like, is that what is a pretext for war? Is that what happens? We can't talk. Now we have different value hierarchies. Now we're using English, but we're not using the right words, right? So now we have this conflict brewing, and it gets to the point where, no, I think it's actually immoral not to, give my kids these, if I say it steel man their way, gender affirm what they believe. It's cruel not to. And then the other side would be like, well, it's cruel to sterilize them before they're ready to make that decision. Right. And also cruel to the future to deprive that kind of life and its potentiality. Right. So, and again, that's a more higher context. That's probably why I go past but like that kind of thought process, like, oh shit.
Yeah. That's where you're going to, and what I like about that too, is that you're negotiating both sides in that you're actually fairly stating your opposition while you're stating yours. And you're saying, these are a conflict of value. And what we need to do in a conflict of value is decide what we think is true based upon our first principles that we hold close, we put up on the mantle, as you said, and then negotiate through that. And then that's how, when people honestly do that, is they're more likely that you're going to get to an outcome where we can all agree.
Where there's no shooting.
Or at least there's enough agree.
And I would say human history would say most of the time we end up in shooting, or at least a good deal amount. So hopefully we don't do that. But you can see how that happens.
Well, political violence is on the rise. Like there's a lot of poli-sci about that right now. About how much more political violence we've seen in the last 5 years versus the last 20 years before that.
When you say that, like violence against the left from the right and vice versa?
Yeah, all the way around. I mean, which way it goes, I'm not trying to talk about right now because I don't actually know, but I know that there's just like this politically motivated violence is increasing.
Gotcha. Yeah, one question that came to mind as you guys were discussing this is like, what happens if you've already sort of internalized and integrated ideas that you had only considered through your fast thinking, right? And you've brought them too close, and now they're a part of your worldview. They're maybe a part of your identity,
Oh, yeah.
but you didn't vet them, and now you're coming up against evidence from the world that's contrary to your now internalized view of what is right. You've got this cognitive dissonance. How do you overcome that safely, in a sense that when someone's deep down identity is challenged to a fundamental level, can it be like kind of dangerous? Like you can kind of break a person if everything they believe to be true about a certain thing, they're then revealed is false. Like, isn't that sort of risky? And is there a safe way out of it?
Well, yeah, I think the hard part is what replaces, because they are going to believe something's true. Even if it's like nothing's true, like it's still believing something.
Well, it happens when you come in contact with something you can't deny, right? And then you have to die, right? That part of you has to die off, right? It's like a forest needs a fire to burn through and take care of all that dead wood and reinvigorate into something and regenerate.
Elevate your understanding, if you will.
Right.
Not to die and elevate. I'm not going to go any farther than that.
But if your ideas,
you can be religious on the podcast.
I'm not going to. I'm not going to do that.
This is funny. I will say the edgiest stuff about the trans people, but I'm not. You can talk about religion stuff.
I'm not going to do that. I shouldn't do that.
All right.
I shouldn't do that.
All right.
So I won't.
Yes, sir. But I will though. So if you're,
I'm going to keep answering this question, but I just wouldn't go full theology. I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I'm not a theologian.
But going into your cocoon, like that statement of regeneration, I've done this several times. I mean, there was a point in my life where I supported the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and all that kind of stuff. I was a kid, right, who saw 9/11 happen on TV, and then I remember the first thing.
I'm guilty.
Yeah, right, and having that moment where I'm talking with this guy, and he's like, "Are you familiar with the CIA's actions in Iran and blowback?" No, I have no idea about that. And then I had to go look at it, and I'm reading it, I'm seeing this stuff, and feeling completely embarrassed for what I believed in. Over time, as I slowly let that fire burn away, a lot of things that were based on nationalism and jingoism and like this unthinking, heuristic-based, tribal-based way of thinking of the world, and then replacing it with something that is much more closer, seeing humanity as a whole and the potential that we could have had, but I didn't have the information to understand how much better the world could have been if these policies were different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I will defend heuristics because they're getting bashed on, but I like heuristics, especially like cultural heuristics that seem to hold. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of times the zeitgeist or the time we live in will dictate a certain thing. Like there's a thing in literature and science about time bias. Like I'm measuring this thing in this window, and it tells me this thing. But if I had opened the window, it would not. I would not have exactly like we're going down instead of up. You know what I mean? So heuristics, you might not just be living a time where they are effective, which is one reason to change them. So it's another fact. Like maybe you have to change heuristics, but I'll go a lower level than foreign policy. This happens to me. Like there'll be a business owner that says, "Oh, these are my heuristics for my business," and that worked in year 1. I don't know if they should work in year 5. You know what I mean? But at the same time, like how you, from my angle, I want to change those heuristics because you're going to be less successful in my mind. So from the outside, I'm busy propagandizing this guy or whatever, right? But as far as like if that's your guy, I just think you don't know. Yeah. That's like you're just unaware, and I think you have to cut yourself. Where like cognitive dissonance, when it's happening, you don't know what's happening. It's only like after, like you said, you almost kind of die a little bit. Like my entire worldview just died. It's buried. But after that, hopefully, you get a better worldview. That's more, I get elevated to the truth if you had to put the truth up there, and you're getting a little bit better. That's what I meant by the truth being elevated, which is straight scripture.
Awesome. What a great conversation.
Got any more questions? Or
Oh man, I'm only a million, but we don't probably have time.
I live
for
here.
that.
You guys can bring me back when hopefully there's no technical. Does the battery still work?
Every 10 episodes.
Everything's good.
Oh my goodness.
Every 10 episodes, and they go on locals so that people have to pay to see them. And
is there locals?
Censored. Well, we're just getting it kicked off.
Yeah, we're just working it all out now.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So part of this conversation will probably be our trial run at some paywall.
I think you guys need to get demonetized. Or else how are you saying you're a real podcast without?
Is that a badge of honor now?
I think so. It's like red badge of courage, right? Like you need to get.
well, we haven't been monetized, so
that's a good point.
Yeah, get to there first.
They got to give us the money before they could take it away.
My bad.
Yeah, we're trying to get to